Welcome to the Spool podcast. Unwind with Dr. Nils Roemer, Dean of the Bass School at UT Dallas.
All right, we're really excited to welcome today Tim Cloward and be able to introduce and discuss a little bit his book. It has a snappy title, The City That Killed the President, but in a way, the book is very much about a past that we still have to master. That would be fair to say. But maybe before we go there, we have multiple ways of connecting you to UT Dallas, one of which is your PhD. We just talked about it. You graduated here in 2002. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that time? Because, in lots of ways, the campus has changed, faculty has changed, but...
It's incredibly different than when I started here. So I actually have 3 degrees here. I spent the end of my undergraduate time here. Mm-hmm. I got a master's here and then followed through with a PhD here. So I spent on and off about 2 straight decades as a
Wow.
UTD student. So there were gaps in between, but I was a long-term UTD student.
Now tell me, though, your PhD was not in history, right? It was not history of ideas?
It ended up being classified as aesthetic studies.
No, which I find interesting because we can kind of return to this because your book, in a way, is not a history in a more traditional way, but it's a kind of reimagining how it unfolded, but then it's also almost a travelogue of various sites, and so the very way how you're writing it is at times, really experimental or a little different from a standard historical account. And I was wondering whether that has to do with the fact that you just said your chair was Fred Turner. Fred mm-hmm. Turner, one of our longtime faculty members, a poet.
Yes.
Right.
So so back in the day, we had the interdisciplinarity was really loose. I remember as coming in as a undergrad, and improv was a required course for undergrads in the humanities, and there was a real emphasis on going all over the place. And I have to admit, by the time I got the PhD, the designation of aesthetic studies was surprising to me.
It's a snazzy title, aesthetic studies. I mean, that, in lots of ways is quite distinguished. But let's get into the meat of this, because obviously anyone is kind of interested about this. I said, very quickly introducing you that this is about a history that is not just simply done and passed, but more of a complicated inheritance in your account that I think in the end, as a reader, one is left that, the sense that it still needs to be mastered. It hasn't been quite mastered. You can tell that, by the way I speak, I'm originally from Germany, which is all mm-hmm. about the mastering of their complicated past. Yes. Very different story, not making any comparisons. But the way you describe this is really something that kind of almost created a breach in the city, a kind of indelible mark that has remained at least for decades thereafter. Would that be a fair summary of how you're describing this?
Yes, I've been sort of more and more thinking about how kind of this chronology of Dallas history is laid out when people talk about our kind of where we come from. And it's sort of like our own local Gregorian calendar where in the center is the assassination and what happens before the assassination and what happens after the assassination. That the assassination sort of overwhelms all other historical events, and when we look at our past here.
But as you point out, the assassination obviously is that horrendous peak of sorts, but then there are any number of other incidences that you bring to the fore. One of them called the Mink Coat incidents or yes. whatever. So tell us a little, because that's important, I think, that because you're trying really hard to convey that, as the other famous quote from JFK goes, as he was, I think, on his way to Dallas, we're going to enter nut country or something. There was yes, a sense, right? I mean, there was
as he comes into land, he literally tells his staff, "We're going into nut country."
Yeah.
So
in other words, a city already ripe with conflict and contentious issues, But I'm sorry, I distracted you from the Mink Coat now. So let's go back to the Mink
Well,
Coat.
the reason that the Dallas gets this rap that the other cities where assassinations occur is because we had built ourselves up a sort of reputation around America as this hotbed of kind of radical right-wing Red Scare paranoia. And so kind of the most prominent couple of events in 1960, there's the Mink Coat Mob, where LBJ and Lady Bird, are going through the Adolphus lobby, one of the kind of classiest places in Dallas, and you have this crowd spitting on Lady Bird and Lyndon and kind of jostling them. And there are some people who say this was a thing that had a really significant effect and could have pushed the election to Kennedy. So it was a very high profile event there with our Neiman Marcus ladies and their furs being incredibly uncivil. And then just almost a month before Kennedy's arrival, there was the incident with Adlai Stevenson. And his UN Day speech was broken up, and it was quite a kerfuffle. And even as he's trying to drive away, a crowd tries to tip over the car with Stanley Marcus. In fact, Stanley Marcus is in both these events. He's with LBJ. Right before that, he's with Adlai Stevenson as they try and get away. And so Time magazine, the week after that, called Dallas a city disgraced. And so we had established this reputation, and before that there had been some very prominent protests at the museums to pull out the Picassos because he was a communist.
That's right. And Stanley Marcus is actually at that time also involved a little bit, because I think he was one of the committee members of the museum.
As sort of the one liberal in
and so he was himself like caught, and I think he's tied to this story also insofar as I believe he is, after the assassination of JFK, he's the one who distributes the speech that was never given, right? So JFK was meant to give a speech, which I actually going to reference, and you know exactly why, because it has this UTD connection. So maybe we can I need to get this one out, and then we'll get back to this kind of mark. But one of the interesting parts that ties in lots of ways this incredible horrendous event together of sorts with UTD is that already in 1961, this research center of the Southwest had been formed, and JFK was meant in his visit to speak about the significance of this research center that he would have likened to MIT and Caltech, and would have played out the importance of how political leadership and learning would have opened up a new future. But obviously none of that happened. For us, this is really important because at least two, if not more, of the faculty that was in attendance waiting for JFK to come were faculty members that ultimately taught for many years at UT Dallas, one of them being Wolfgang Rindler, who was a mathematician, and then on the other side, Zsuzsanna Aschwart, who was a Holocaust survivor and the kind of creator of our Holocaust program. But it's out of that, and then I leave the UT Dallas history behind.
But
it's out of that.
Was at the Market Center?
Yes.
That's
and they both gave testimony, actually, to that. And in the kind of UT Dallas lore, that's sometimes told in our UT Dallas magazine. So as I was thinking about today and how you also talk about the legacy and what potentially as a society we have to do moving forward, some of the very things that JFK would have said in that speech about the importance of learning, science, study, truth, and all those, uncannily maybe remain relevant. But just to kind of sum up the UT Dallas connection, it is out of that research center that then UT Dallas gets created in 1969. So that's our direct lineage.
No, I have another one. I'll hold off till another, but remind me of my newest UTD.
There's one more. Yeah, we always like to spin it all together. That in lots of ways it all kind of culminates in UT Dallas. Of course,
it all starts here.
It all starts here, of course. But so we were with the Mink Coat Mob, and then obviously with the assassination of JFK. Now your book is very clear that you're not subscribing to any of the conspiracy theories, but in the matter of fact, there's quite a bit of talk in your book about how conspiracy theories are becoming this way of coping / not coping, but denying almost what actually had happened. So there are lots of ways the very existence of these conspiracy theories are indicative of the fact that one looks desperately for really incredible, mysterious ways of how this could have come, rather than to look into the mirror, right? That's
the magical thinking, and also you can always demonize somebody if you have a conspiracy theory. So
much so that I think you coined this term, I had never come across this, that Dallas becomes this mecca of conspiracy theorists and a tourist site, so to speak, a destination for anyone of that ilk. Which, however, in your mind is really cementing this inability to really live up to that legacy of what had happened in that city, the kind of proliferation of these conspiracy theories, right?
Yeah, well, one of the points I try and make fairly subtly in the book is that Dallas was this mecca for the old style Red Scare paranoia, and kind of that John Birch early 60s paranoia. And then, ironically, after the assassination, that gets tamped down because of the shame, the shock. But then it is the kind of this point zero for the development of this new, I mean, you could even class a more liberal kind of conspiracy theory. And you know, in the 70s, there's the recognition of the abuses of the CIA, and then there's the Watergate, and you know, kind of this growing fear that you know, there is stuff going on in the government that we need to be aware of and paranoid about. And then, of course, with the internet now, it's just exploding.
Well, now, I mean, you know, that's like, I was about to go there, that, you know, in lots of ways, the proliferation of these theories still exist, you know, all happened before technology, so to speak. It just happened still in a kind of old-fashioned way. But I think it's also, what is it called, the Warren Commission, that is like trying to debunk each one of them, right? Not Russia, not Cuba, not the mafia. They go down the whole list, but in strange ways, I guess, then, because it's an official commission, it just, you know, it's then perceived as the ultimate proof that there's a cover-up and space for a need for alternative explanations.
Yes, it's just by being official, it's linked to Watergate, it's linked to the CIA. It's part of that overarching thing that we have to be aware of.
So why, in your mind, is the kind of ability to confront that, or has not been there? Why is this, rather do people keep subscribing to these conspiracy theories than to kind of confront the most obvious answer, maybe in this case?
That is the big question in America right now. So
that's why we're here, you know, that we like to ask those big questions, right?
So when I wrote the book, I had talked to some historians who I respected, and there was sort of this grumbling about there's the kind of the Tea Party mentality, and we have to kind of watch out for that conspiracy mongering. And then there was the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Really one of my intentions was at the closing, the Guardian of the Ghost, was to have people read this book and think about how are we responsible for that sort of paranoia that occurred in Dallas in 1963, and this implication that today, if we are part of a conspiracy mongering culture, what do we do about that? How much do each one of us bear as far of a burden for allowing that society to nurture that sort of thinking?
Well, that's an interesting question. So why is it that conspiracy theories are so incredibly popular these days? And I think you go a little bit also into this, that it's kind of the lack of trust in institutions, lack of trust in kind of public forum and communication.
Yeah.
So you do have the proliferation of these things, I suppose, if I read this correctly, because many other things are not exactly working as they should.
Yes. But a growth of cynicism, general cynicism, where it's impossible to trust anything. And then also, especially in the media culture we have today, just wonderful creativity you can put into conspiracy theories. Well, I teach high school. And
the wonderful creativity that you can, I think people may quote you on that line, right? The wonderful creativity that you can put into. No, I know what you mean.
You could know a little bit and just fill in all the rest and have this all-encompassing story that explains everything.
You know, the strange thing, I was wondering about this also. What is the appeal? I mean, you know, sometimes you meet people who you think are really, really intelligent, and why do they subscribe to these kind of theories? And I think there's something really also in an odd sense of very empowering to the individual who subscribes to these, because all of a sudden they think they have become the holder and the discoverer of something that really explains it all. So this is like an incredibly rewarding moment of sorts, right?
It is, because you could know just a few things, and then you're drawing these connections, and there's the thrill of putting these connections
like I can
together.
Explain this, that, and all the others.
Yeah, and you may leave huge gaps in between that might ruin the story, but you're making those connections, and you know, those endorphins are going off in your head, and
yeah, that's like a little bit, you know, that I was just looking, and your book came out in 23. Which means some of the hard work you did in the years prior. So in between our world, social media being one of them, is almost, you know, on a monthly, you know, basis, it's like changing. I mean, like, I think what you could call information overload in 22 or 21, and what it is in 25 has dramatically changed. Our abilities to manipulate information, distort them, artificially create them between when you were writing the book and now.
Yeah.
You know, has dramatically changed again, right?
Yeah, so there's a term I adopted, prosthetic memory, that in fact we have this limited amount of memory that we walk around with, but now we have, with all our electronic gadgets, this connection to huge amounts of memory that we can harness in all sorts of ways. And many of them not related to truth whatsoever.
So I think, do you use this term reluctant city? Dallas being a reluctant and kind of bracing itself for a real future because it can never quite shed its past. Is that the way you would put it?
Well, Dallas is always, it's interesting. So the commentary on ourselves is always, you know, that Dallas is this kind of head above all the other cities, and that we are more sophisticated and
we are, no doubt, right?
And obviously richer.
Right? You get a lot of nods from everyone here.
But then within that, there's been this kind of this self-consciousness about that you know, that we have to somehow always make sure we're walking the walk and you know, propping up these kind of extravagant claims that we always make about ourselves. So you know, we do have this self-confidence that it kind of has this hollow self-consciousness within it.
So let's for a moment assume you would be welcoming a group of visitors to the city, and you really would want them to understand something about, you know, what's at the core of this book. Where would you take them? I mean, there are a couple of possibilities, and you describe them, but which place do you think brings out most in your mind this kind of unsorted past of sorts that's still, well, in a way, almost haunting us at time, I guess, right?
That, and in fact, there's always been that we have visitors come to town. They're going to ask you to take you to Dealey Plaza, and for a while that kind of was superseded by the home from Dallas, and the northern suburb where you want to go see where Dallas was.
Where the TV show was.
Yeah, the TV Dallas.
Yes.
But now I think we shifted back.
Right, that's one of your favorite shows. You're smiling, right?
South Fork.
That's it. It's an odd kind of, do we go there or do we go there? I mean, there's like, you know, there's not a lot of connecting parts to this one.
But that, I hate to say it, I'm somewhat baffled that, like, if you wanted to get to the history of Dallas, where would you go?
Right.
And one thing that I think is very telling when we talk about our own history, the obvious place is where John Neely and Bryan had his homestead, his original homestead, which is, of course, Dealey Plaza. But that is completely obscured by the assassination. Everybody goes there for the assassination, and they in their mind, all of this is exactly as it was in 1963, and that's Dallas. And kind of ironically enough, one of the interesting things I didn't get in this volume was that when they were about to finally get to that really difficult process of establishing the sixth floor museum, they had to do one more thing. They had to build an elevator to get up to the sixth floor, and they had to do some digging there, and it was mandated that they had to do an archaeological dig there. And there was this great scare that this could delay the museum at this critical point when they were finally getting it off the ground, and it was a incredible challenging thing because so many people resisted it. And they found evidence of the cornfield of John Wiley Bryant, and they were really worried, the museum administrators, that this would then require more excavations and more digging there to get to this original Dallas history, and there was a lot of pressure to cover that back up and get the museum built.
Interesting.
But really, when people think of Dealey Plaza, that they forget John Neely Bryan, the original cabin there, the cornfield. That was where literally he worked with other people to lay out the plats that the streets run on now. That was where the original bridge was that Sarah and John Cockerell built, and so that was Dallas right there, and that is really completely obscured by the assassination mythology.
What do you think about the memorial itself and its design that's there?
Well, there's Dealey Plaza, and then there's the Philip Johnson Memorial, which is a cross behind the old Red Courthouse. So it's very interesting that the placement there, that there was no talk of really doing anything in Dealey Plaza. They wanted to separate that from Dealey Plaza, and just it's an interesting cenotaph, but it has no imagery or obvious connection visually.
No, it doesn't. That's the striking part about it, right? In particular, most people, it's probably fair to say, drive by there, right? I mean, it's Dallas, so what do? We usually don't walk around as much. We're in our cars, and so that's what I find so striking, that visually, it's like you could mistake it for any other. Right, it's not anything that is.
In fact, it could be seen as a screen that obscures more than it displays. So the idea behind it is noble, and you're there to meditate. But if you look at kind of the history of Dallas trying to figure out what to do with the assassination, it is kind of a damning design that looks like a way to obscure history rather than to confront it. And then also just around the block there is that the cabin that for so long was proclaimed to be the Bryant cabin, which is not. So we have this sort of bogus original cabin there, and just a block away from that, which I think says some things about Dallas and its approach to history.
So when you write a book like that, The City That Killed the President, A Cultural History of Dallas and the Assassination, you talk about that lasting impact that it left on the city. You kind of, as you come to your conclusion for your readers, you kind of want to direct a little bit again, like, okay, how do we move forward from here, right? And so I think you're doing there, and then also there was another article I think that you published. You're trying to kind of make sure that on the one side your readers understand how in your mind unresolved this is, but also you kind of try to guide them a little bit into a path forward. You want to talk a little, what does it take in your mind, like to, or what should be done to kind of move us forward?
I think the one great successful gesture was when Mike Rollins in the 50th staged that one commemoration that was, and it was the first civic organized event commemorating John F. Kennedy in Dealey Plaza. And so he came in and took over Dealey Plaza and had this ceremony that literally was designed for Dallas and the people of Dallas. And that was a watershed in how we would deal with that. And I spoke to so many people who kind of spoke out publicly for the first time leading up to that. That they had basically kind of kept these experiences in the shell and not verbalized oftentimes. So a lot of people had kind of cathartic moments of kind of expressing their relationship to the event 50 years after the fact. And so really that was a great citywide ritual. And there was this outpouring of kind of memories and people still dealing with all of this. And I don't think we've done anything like that since.
So that would be one way of going forward,
it's
just
a
a
public
kind
ritual.
of public rituals of kind of recognizing actually the past, and thereby also annually engaging in a wider public conversation again about what that means and how it was remembered.
And the sixth floor has done a wonderful job, but they are always walking on eggshells. It's got to be like one of the worst positions to have in Dallas is to run the sixth floor museum, because there's so much pressure from all sorts of different directions. So they do what they can, but they're kind of inherently kind of conservative and just trying to keep the museum going, and not really wanting to do anything that's going to rock the boat very much. So really, there is not much that's going on where we confront this, and obviously it's 62 years now, so the edge is coming off of it. But there is a lot going on there that's worth talking about.
But you know, the kind of edge coming, in a way though, it's still, I mean, you talked about the prevalence of conspiratorial theories. I mean, that has perpetuated itself, and those that espouse them very much today also see almost that as a bit of their rallying ground of sorts, right? And
yes, and you mentioned the conspiracy tourism, but I think kind of the political upheaval that happened with Kennedy's assassination, really, because I think of the strength of our democracy at the time, that there was this transition and LBJ took over, and so politically. And the historians who are covering that, they have done their work. So historically and politically, kind of the story is taking care of itself, and as America handles it. But it's culturally, and especially with the idea of the conspiracy theory. So right now, I think the big story, if you look back at that, kind of how it affects us today, is that conspiracy mindset has been unloosened. And so it links the old traditional Red Scare there, and then kind of hypercharges it with this new technology-driven conspiracy.
And it does mean, I mean, you know, that we seem to have a harder time as a society maybe dealing with things, the pandemic being one of them, just with simple communication about what is actually happening and for what reason. I mean, even like when, you know, something that really literally threatened the health of each one of us as a society here and more globally, we had a really hard time really making everyone understand that this was, you know, not the outcome of some wild conspiracy, but it was a health threat that we could have more easily contained, probably, if we would have.
In the past it might have unified us. And now with this sort of conspiracy mindset, it's a thing that can be used as a wedge to tear society apart.
No, scary stuff of sorts. In particular, like I said, you wrote this book. You did probably much of the research during the pandemic, almost as you were writing. Came out in 23.
Actually, it helped.
You did, But then, you know, our world otherwise, from the perspective of technology, is so rapidly changing. You promised us one other UTD connection. I just put all mine early on the table, but you said you had one more to give.
This is one that happened just a few months ago, last November 22nd. The Sixth Floor Museum was doing their commemorations this year. And they had a Dr. Tony Glover who was going to speak about her experience. And Tony Glover, I graduated. She was a PhD candidate when we graduated together. And she was speaking there, so it caught my attention.
Oh, fantastic.
And it turns out that UTD alumni Antoinette Glover was the girl in blue. And so in Dealey Plaza on that day, that there was a young girl, I think she was 11 at the time, standing on one of the pedestals just in front of the turn on Elm Street, where the president was shot, and so she had this excellent view there, and she shows up on all of the the prominent film and photographs. So everybody who's really into that says, who is the girl in blue?
Oh, she's the one.
And in fact, it turns out that was Tony Glover. She. And I never talked to her about this, and this was before I was even thinking about doing a cultural history. But she had been dealing with this trauma her entire life, and so I think in 1998 or something, she came into the museum to talk to somebody, and the way she describes it, as soon as she started talking, she started bawling. And then they took her in, and then they interviewed her and attended to her, and she told them their story, and she, I think very soon will be publishing a book. She's just kind of 2/3 of the way through it on her experience as being that girl. And when she spoke in the museum, that they did display all these photographs, and then there's 11-year-old Tony from this angle, there she is from this angle. And so she is very well documented to the point where people already had been discussing the girl in blue.
Maybe just finish up the last part that's relevant to this book, or many more, obviously. It's called Volume 1. So tell us about, are there 2 more volumes coming?
I have the 2 volumes kind of mapped out and a good amount of research. There needs to be much larger demand by the book buying published.
That's a problem these days.
Yes, so I have it mapped out, and this was, and again, I started kind of this cultural history stuff kind of late in my career, so I did a huge amount of research and wasn't quite sure how to make it all congeal together, and finally got this 1 volume, and I think, now I know what I'm doing. So we will see what happens.
So we'll see Volume 2 and Volume 3. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.